Welcome back. Today we're going to do a review of the Liber Strategia, and we're going to go through not every single point's change, but we are going to highlight the main things that I think are good and bad about what has been done to Legions Imperialis in the Liber Strategia. And spoiler alert, on the whole, I think it is a very successful attempt to kind of move the game forward and bring it into a positive state that new players can join and old players can adjust and start using some of the units that maybe they passed over before because they weren't particularly effective on the tabletop. So the plan, the breakdown is we're going to go through each faction individually, and I'm going to give you my thoughts on what is good, bad, or indifferent about the changes that have been made for that faction. And then there will be some final thoughts at the end. And then, of course, at the very end of the video, I'm going to summarize and wrap everything up. So we're going to start with the knight households. And this is one of the major changes, I think, that have been made in Liber Strategia. And lots of good here. The main thing I think that everybody will notice from right off the bat is that the points costs of the knights have been decreased almost universally, which is huge because for the longest time since the beginning of the game, the knights have really been overcosted for what they deliver. So I think this change is going to make knights much more competitive on the table in the sense that they will be much more efficient. You're going to get more for your point. Now, they've also improved armor saves to 2+ for, I think, every knight chassis, which is great. That's going to make knights more durable and more long-lasting on the table, which, again, is why they were not such a good choice before, because they cost a lot of points and they were very easy to destroy. Armigers are now separate detachments, which is another great change. You could always kind of do this because the knights had the independent special rule, and so the armigers could form kind of a base which the knights would operate around. But having them be separate now just makes everything easier. You can use the armigers more for objective control and just more tactically in general now that they are separate detachments. As far as the bad goes, while Games Workshop has adjusted ion shields, they're still useless. And that's not because they made a bad change, they improved the values, but because the armor save has also been increased, ion shields really aren't going to be used that much, except in pretty edge cases, maybe where you're struck by something with armor bane, which of course has an effect against an armor save, but if you take your ion save, you would not have to suffer the negative effects of armor bane. So there are some edge cases where maybe an ion shield would be a better choice, but in general, because of the universal increase of both ion shields and armor saves, it's really not going to do much for the knights, which is really unfortunate because the ion shields, are a big part of the knights and their capabilities, and the fact that it is really not a competitive option, I think just isn't very rewarding. There's also some knight variants which just aren't viable still, even with the points decrease, because the points decrease is universal across all of the chassis. Some of the knights, like the Acheron and the Castigator, the one with the Flamer and the Gatling Cannon, they're just not really competitive, I don't think, when compared to something like the Lancer or the Atropos. So that's unfortunate. I think Games Workshop could have done more to improve these knight chassis and make them a little bit more interesting and more of a decent choice on the table. Whether that's through improving their weapons or decreasing their points even more, I think either way they could have done more. The indifferent, now this is stuff that I would have liked to have seen, but I really wasn't expecting, and so I'm not that disappointed. There's no household rules for the knights, and there's minimal and uninteresting lance rules for the different individual styles of lances. I'm not an expert on knights, but I know they have different formations, kind of like how the Collegia Titanica has specific formations, compositions of titans within specific kinds of maniples. And I really would have liked to have seen some maybe more creative rules writing for these lance rules, and also for just the knight households in general, which have their own feudal character and behavior that I think Games Workshop could have imported into Legions Imperialis. So overall, knights are, I think, going to be more viable now, but Games Workshop has missed an opportunity to give them a bit more flavor than they had on release. If I was going to offer any suggestions, I would say that knights should probably have been given split fire. Because they have such mixed weapon compositions, it really is kind of a shame that you can't split fire. And I don't see why. I think there are household and lance rules in Adeptus Titanicus, and I don't see why Games Workshop couldn't just import those rules into Titanicus, or excuse me, into Legions Imperialis from Titanicus. I know obviously these are two very different games, but it seems like they've already done design work to figure out how these rules would work on a small scale. And it doesn't seem like it would be too hard to take those rules from Titanicus and transfer them over, figure out how they would be replicated in Legions Imperialis. Moving on to the Dark Mechanicum, there's really not much that Games Workshop has done to this faction, which is good because they were very recently released, and so having a lot of changes, I think, would not necessarily be a good thing, especially since I think the Dark Mechanicum was a fairly balanced faction anyway. So there's not really any bad here. I do think that there is a bit too much light anti-tank in the list, and so the Dark Mechanicum doesn't necessarily have a lot of punch at range. Of course, they have the Air Axe, which is an incredibly scary close combat vehicle. But I would have liked to have seen maybe a little bit of adjustment in the weapon traits so that these supposedly very scary artificial intelligence stalkers might have had a little bit more reach and punch at range. I'm also still a bit mystified why the archers have no construct shield. Um, I know there's supposedly a lore reason for why it doesn't have it. As far as I know, the lore was created in the book for these models. So it seems like they're shooting themselves in their own foot here, right? The construct shields are such a big part of the Dark Mechanicum's flavor, and they're just their faction profile, that for one of their main units just to not have it is a bit strange. But it's not a huge deal. So overall, I mean, there's really not much to say about the Dark Mechanicum in Liber Strategia. I think they're in a good place. I think the faction is pretty balanced. They have, some decent strengths, but they also have weaknesses as well that make them an interesting force to play and to play against. The Mechanicum are more or less in the same boat as the Dark Mechanicum. There's not too much that has been changed. We do have the ability to take more tech thralls per detachment now, which I think was good. It made sense given that these are supposed to be hordes of techno zombies, and being able to take only 10 in a detachment felt a little bit off theme. But I think we're able to take 15 now instead of 10, which I think is a good number. Myrmidon Destructors have increased in points, which I think is only fair. This is a very good, very flexible unit, a very tough unit, and I think it seems perfectly reasonable, especially with the clarification in the FAQ that they do have both weapons, the Conversion Beamer and the Volkite, and not just one or the other. I think that makes a lot of sense, and I don't have any issue with Games Workshop adjusting the points in the positive direction. The Triaros has also gotten a points increase, which I think makes sense also. They were very cheap in the original release. I think they were 17 points or something. And so I think they've gone up to 25. So again, transports are much more important now, especially after the FAQ, right, where infantry can no longer march 3 times their move. They can only march 2 times their move. So I think a points increase was needed in the first place just because the Triaros was so cheap, but also now because it's more important, I think it makes sense that they would cost a few more points. The only strange change that I noticed, the only maybe bad thing, was that the Domitar missile launcher has been reduced in the number of shots. It also hasn't really been brought into line with the other missile launchers in the Solar Auxilia, the Astartes factions. So it's a little strange to me. I don't really use the Domitar, but maybe those who do can tell me maybe there's some particular reason why this has been adjusted. A few indifferent things that I don't know whether they're necessarily good or not. The Ursarax now have Rend, which makes them quite scary. I think they have a native +3, so that plus Rend really makes them a very dangerous combatant in close combat. They've had their points cost increased, which seems only fair since they've had Rend added to their profile. The only thing that still kind of mystifies me is that the Ursarax is a very rare detachment. I think there are only 2 formations that you can take them in, and those formations are not necessarily ones that I would choose. So I don't know. I was kind of glad that they got a boost, but also still disappointed that they're pretty difficult to take. And since close combat is something that I think the Mechanicum somewhat struggles with anyway, I think we could have definitely used with maybe an adjustment to the formations to give them the ability to be taken more often and more easily. The Carachnos and the Venator have had their points reduced. The Carachnos is pretty good. I'm not sure why it necessarily needed to have its points reduced. I think it's for taking more in the detachment. It's a pretty good tank. I haven't used it that much, so I'm not sure if it's really necessary, but maybe, again, others who have played with it more than I can explain maybe why this change was made. The Venator, I can definitely understand why the points have been reduced, because it has such short range that I really, personally, I don't see myself ever using it. The indifferent part is that I think they probably should have reduced the points more. I think it was only a 5-point reduction. So that is still not really enough to make me think about choosing it over the Krios. Overall, minor tweaks for the Mechanicum in the Liber Strategia, mostly in line with what I think was needed. Really a few changes here and there just to bring it into line with the FAQ and to adjust a few units that were maybe a little too strong or not strong enough. So again, mostly good choices, just a few things kind of seemed a bit strange. Moving on to the Collegia Titanica, almost every Titan has seen a price decrease, as well as having more wounds and more void shields. The only Titan that has had a points increase is the War Master, which I think everybody knows and agrees was necessary. So all of these things combine to make the Collegia Titanica a much more effective and viable choice, just like we talked about with the Knight households, right? Titans were very expensive and generally didn't have the durability that you needed to get a return on your investment. Not to mention the fact that they just didn't feel like they were these titanic god engines that the Imperium pulls out to crush the most fierce resistance. And so I'm glad to see that Games Workshop has acknowledged the issue with the Titans and has taken steps to make them more viable and more thematic on the tabletop. What they haven't done, though, which I think was almost as badly needed, was to give some kind of points differential for the weapons that are available to the Titans. And so it's just a bit strange. I mean, they clearly know that some weapons are better than others or are underpowered, and yet you can take these weapons for the same points as a much more effective weapon. So this was something that I was really kind of hoping that the Collegia Titanica would receive from Games Workshop in this update in the Liber Strategia, but it doesn't look like that's the case. So you're still going to be paying the same points for a conversion beamer as you are for an Ursus Claw. So take that for what it's worth. I think that's a real missed opportunity from Games Workshop. Speaking of adjusted weapons, right, the Plasma Blast Gun now has 3 dice instead of the 2 that it had before. And this carries through the rest of the model range. Every model that has a Plasma Blast Gun is now firing 3 dice, which is, a great change. I think the Plasma Blast Gun was already a competitive weapon, not for Titans, but for things like the Stormblade and so on. The Plasma Blast Gun is still too short-ranged, though. For me, I would very rarely take the Plasma Blast Gun, if ever, even with 3 dice. It's just slightly less bad of a choice than it was before. So I still don't see why they made these changes, but not necessarily enough to bring this weapon up into the realm of competitive with the other options that you have on the table. There's still no Maniple or Legio rules, so I won't belabor the point. I've already kind of talked about this with the Knight households, but I think it's a real missed opportunity for Games Workshop to inject some flavor and character into the Collegia Titanica that it's really been missing. So overall, the Titans are much more viable now than they were before. They cost less. They're more durable. I think personally, these are somewhat uncreative solutions. They've just added more wounds, more void shields. I'm not sure. I mean, there are set limits for the void shields. I'm trying to think of how to express this, but the number of void shields for these different chassis are established already. So I kind of don't really like that they're adjusting them. If that makes sense, right? I mean, like in the lore, in the setting, Warlord is described as having a certain number of void shields. Maybe this is a nitpicky thing, but I feel like they should stick with that and maybe come up with another solution than just giving more void shields and more wounds. I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that Titans still are not going to feel like how they should, based on the fiction that we've read, and we've grown up understanding these things to be, god engines of destruction, right? And in the tabletop, generally, in my experience, they don't really feel that way. So some suggestions that I have, and feel free to comment on these down in the comments section. Let me know what you think. But I think personally, especially now that the Knight households have been bumped up to a 2+ armor save, I think all Titans across the board should have +1 armor. That would make them, a lot tougher. It would make them immune to light anti-tank weapons, and I just think this would make them feel much more durable and impressive. Now, obviously, they'd have to have a points maybe adjustment, but I think that would go a long way. I think also void shields should have a save. This is a special rule that's added in the Titan Death expansion, the Titan Death rules. I think it's a 5+ save that void shields have in that game mode. I think instead of increasing the number of void shields, maybe just give them a save. I think that's how it's done in Adeptus Titanicus as well, and I think that would help a lot to make Titans feel a lot more durable, feel more alive. And again, I'm going to harp on this. I think they need to import the Legio and Maniple rules from Titanicus. I've already explained my reasoning for the Knight households, but they've already done the design work to make these rules for Titanicus. I don't necessarily see why it would be particularly hard to import them into Legions Imperialis from Titanicus. In general, I also think weapons need to be better. Um, I know I was just talking about how there are some weapons better than others, right? A lot of these weapons I think need to be brought up to the level of some of the best ones. Like I think the conversion beamer is definitely top tier. I think they need to level out the effectiveness of the weapons and maybe increase their effectiveness even more. Maybe start giving some of these things the ability to deal multiple wounds or to have a blast template, which we really don't have at all in the game. And I think something like the plasma blast gun, right? I think it has a blast template in Titanicus. Giving it a blast template in Legions Imperialis would give it capabilities that another weapon that just shoots a couple of dice wouldn't have, and that would give it something to be competitive. So things that I would like to see, I mean, things to make it more flavorful, to make it feel more like you're controlling this massive machine. Something like maybe the stray shot rule from Titanicus, where if you fire over the heads of your own troops, there's a possibility that any missed shots might hit your own or the enemy's. Just something to make it feel a bit more alive. Overall, though, I don't want to diminish it too much, but I think the studio, the design team has made some great changes that are going to make the Collegia Titanica more of an effective option, and just Titans in general, whether you're playing them as strategic assets or in a Collegia Titanica list, Titans are going to be more effective and you're going to get more for your point. The Solar Auxilia has seen many more changes, so we're going to run through these in a fairly brisk fashion. I'll start off the good things with the addition of what they're calling iconic formations. And I'm actually pretty excited about these. They're similar to formations of Legend, but they're more generic. So they're formations that have something like a specific battlefield role, something like mechanized infantry or armored assault, things like that, that have a very limited choice of detachments. You do have options to expand them. It's just like a formation of Legend. There's really no difference. It's just these are more generic and less tied to specific campaigns, specific places. So from what I've seen, these look like a lot of fun, very characterful, and I'm very interested to try them out on the table and see how they perform. Ogrins are now bulky, which I think everybody agrees they always should have been, and they've had their points increased by quite a bit, which I think we can all agree was very necessary. Ogrins, very effective. They also have 2 wounds, which I'm not too sure about, but because they now have 2 wounds, their points have been increased. It just makes sense. They've always been extremely effective on the table. Now they're more durable. So I think the fact that all these things are good and needed changes. Velitari haven't really had their statistics adjusted, but they have been given a points increase, which again is necessary. Velitari, very effective close combat troops, definitely needed a points increase. Missile launchers on the Ethon Sentinel now hit on 5s, which we're going to see is the same for missile launchers in the Astartes list, which again is a necessary thing. Baneblades have 3 wounds. Again, I'm going to go back to what I said about the Collegia Titanica. I think this is kind of an uncreative option. I always advocated for Baneblades to have a 1-up save from the front, which would have made them immune to light AT weapons, which would have really helped with sort of the fishing for ones, essentially, from your armor save. Um, 3 wounds, I think it's good. I think their detachment size has also been reduced, so I think they're going to feel a little bit more like the super heavy tank that they should, rather than just kind of a heavy tank in groups of, I think you could take 6 or 8. I never did that, but I think you could if you wanted to. Moving on, Malcadors now have a 2-up save, another good change. They're supposed to be a heavy tank, so it didn't always make a lot of sense that they had the same armor save, or a worse armor save, excuse me, as the Leman Russ. So now they're going to feel like more of a proper heavy tank with their 2 wounds and their 2-up save. The Medusa has lost Demolisher, but gained Heavy Barrage, which I think is a good choice. And this is kind of the more nuanced design that I'm advocating for, right? The Medusa has never seemed to me to be competitive with the Leman Russ Demolisher. The Leman Russ Demolisher has a better save. It's got the same weapon. It doesn't have barrage, of course, but I think it's also faster. So this is a chassis that can get to where it needs to be, destroy a building, do some damage to heavy armor if it needs to. And the Medusa has more or less the same capability. Barrage on a 12-inch weapon doesn't seem like that big of a deal to me. So now that it has a special capability, having heavy barrage, which is a pretty rare weapon trait, the Medusa might see more of a comeback. Certainly I'll be giving it a try. The Dracoson now has 2 wounds, bringing it in line with the Malcador in general, which I think makes sense. And it's gained large transport, which will allow it to carry the Ogrons. I think it also allows it to carry Ethon Sentinels because they're walkers, and I guess walkers can fit in a large transport. Let's not do that, guys. I think that's a little silly. I think we can all agree. Yeah. I wish Games Workshop maybe had a little bit more nuance in their transport rules. I know they're trying to keep it simple, but I mean, we had the same discussion with the Triaros, right? When it came out, and you could put the Thanatar Walker, 2 of them, into it. So very silly, but hopefully Games Workshop maybe will come up with some kind of solution to get around that. The Marauder now has 2 wounds, which is a great change. I mean, I really was never tempted to take the Marauder because you had to really drive it into enemy territory to make use of its weapons. And with 1 wound, it just didn't seem likely to me to survive the enemy anti-air fire. So never really something I experimented with, I'll be honest. But now that it's got 2 wounds, I think maybe I'll give it more of a shot. As far as indifferent changes, the multi-laser has lost 2 inches of range. It's now a 12-inch weapon. A little mystified by this as well. I'm not sure why this was needed. I liked that the multi-laser was a little bit different from the heavy bolter, even though, of course, it has light AT. One thing that I think we were all looking for from the design team was to have the Russ and the Malcador given some kind of points differential based on their main armament. And that has been done, but in general, I do not think that enough has been done. I still don't really see myself taking any of these weapon options. The Exterminator, the Executioner, all of these. I mean, the Annihilator maybe is a little bit more competitive now, but the Plasma Cannon is so short-ranged. It's light AT. Same thing with the autocannon armament. I just don't see a need to take it on an armored chassis when you can get that capability to deal with walkers from many other sources. We do have pintle mounts now. I'm indifferent about this because it's a little bit fiddly, but it will really help, I think, balance the game between armor and infantry because you're going to have much more of that anti-infantry firepower because every tank's going to have a heavy stubber or a heavy bolter. And it's going to really mean that you're going to be able to move your vehicles around the table and really deal with infantry, I think, in a much more effective way. Overall, the Solar Auxilia is seeming to be a much more balanced army list. We have a much better balance between the units, so more are viable. Not enough necessarily has been done, but I think on the whole, I think the army list is going to feel much more diverse. The iconic formations are something I'm quite excited about, really interested to try those on the table. And of course, we all know that the Vanquisher is the once and future king. And I'm not sure there's anything that Games Workshop can do short of just nerfing the weapon traits that are going to change that. Some suggestions, and this is driven by the discussion about the weapons on the Leman Russ. I think personally that they should make a blanket change to the weapon traits and say that anti-tank weapons cannot target infantry. And I think this would go a long way to making some of these other weapon options much more viable, because now I know we just talked about balancing the game between vehicles and infantry, but I think that this would be only fair, right? Light weapons can't target vehicles. AT weapons can't target infantry. I think personally it makes sense, and I think it would make a lot of these weapons much more of an interesting choice between them if anti-tank weapons could not target infantry. That's probably a controversial statement. I know infantry is sort of the bugaboo of Legions Imperialis. The boogeyman maybe is a better word. But I do think that this would be a positive change for the game, obviously with concomitant changes surrounding it and adapting to it. We've saved the Astartes for last, partly because that, saved the best for last, right? But also because they've had the most changes made to their army list. And I think, honestly, the most beneficial changes. Starting off with the good things that I've noticed is that they've clarified statistics for tactical marines. So before, it was a little bit unclear what stat line you used in the tactical detachment when you added missile squads or plasma guns to that detachment, whether you used something like the tactical or the missile launcher profile in the independent missile launcher profile. So they've clarified that you do use the separate profile for your missile stat, or for the missile launcher squad, when you're firing with that weapon. So I think that made sense to me. I think that's always how I played it. But I think there was a little bit of discussion about how it should be done. So I'm glad that they made that change. Missile squads have increased in points, and the frag missiles hit on 5s now. So I think all these things, good changes. I think missile squads were just a bit too good compared to some of the other options in the list. Terminators have also gained armored, which is a great change. Terminators have always felt a little bit underwhelming, so now they're going to have a bit more resistance on the table when facing infantry and light fire in general. So good change. Legions Imperialis is a little bit tough to deal with because everything is so zoomed out that it's really hard to make some of these units feel like they might in the 28mm version of Horus Heresy. So I think this is a good middle ground that Games Workshop has taken. Terminators are going to feel better, more like they should. More good changes. Contemptors have now been brought in line with the other Dreadnought chassis. They have a 5-up invulnerable save. Their Carries assault cannon has been given 2 shots, which, while I'm still not quite sure if it would make it something that I would choose over the las cannon, it makes it at least an option rather than something to be dismissed out of hand. The Kratos tank has become less dangerous. It's lost one of its hull weapons, and it has been reduced in points. So I think this is good. I mean, the Kratos was always an excellent vehicle, and it always felt more like a super heavy. And I mean, the Baneblade and the Kratos were very similar um, in their, in their role, and the Kratos is only a heavy tank. So I think it's good that it's been reduced to bring it more in line with what its role is supposed to be. A lot of the fast attack units have been given an increase in their movement value, which I think is very good. It was always a little strange to me that, I mean, this was of course back when infantry could march, 3 times their movement value. It always felt a little bit strange that these sort of hover fast attack vehicles were outpaced or could only outpace a little infantry and other vehicles. So having an increase in move, I think, is perfectly warranted and a good choice. It's going to make them much better on the table, moving around, harassing the flanks, and seizing unattended objectives. The bad things that I've noticed, we now are going to have rhinos with multi-meltas and hunter-killer missiles. So yeah, at least you have to pay points for them, but I can really see people loading these up with infantry or not having infantry at all and just rushing across the table trying to get into multi-melta range on the flanks with their rhinos and their one-shot hunter-killer missiles. So again, I've talked about this in the things that grind my gears about Legions Imperialis video, but it's not something that I think is healthy for the game, and personally, I don't care for it. I also noticed that crack missiles are still hitting on 4 up, even though frag missiles are hitting on 5s. So I don't want to go too much into a rant about missile launchers, but in general, back in the day in 40K, a missile launcher was a good choice because it was an effective weapon that was versatile. It could target infantry and vehicles, not necessarily and being the best heavy weapon at targeting those 2 types of units, but it combined those capabilities into a single package, which made it valuable. As it is right now, I don't see any reason why you would take another weapon other than a missile launcher, especially with crack missiles hitting on 4s, AP -1. There's not really any room to add more heavy weapons, in my opinion, to the Astartes list. I'm also very disappointed, although I guess I wasn't really expecting it, but I'm very disappointed still that there's been no update to the Legion rules, or no meaningful update. I think a few changes have been made, but they really don't materially change the balance of power between the legions. And I think that's a real missed opportunity. I think everybody knows that there are a lot of Legion rules that really aren't particularly effective, and especially aren't particularly effective when compared to some of the other ones, which we will not name in this video. Some of the things that I'm kind of indifferent about: plasma guns have lost range but have gained assault. I think that makes sense based on the lore of the weapons. I think they were always the same range as bolters in 40K. So having their range brought into line with the bolters and being given assault makes sense. I think they were a rapid fire weapon back in the day. I did like the fact that it gave the basic Astartes tactical detachment a little bit of extra reach, a little bit of punch at a longer range. But we'll see how it goes. You can now add apothecaries to tactical detachments without needing to have a command stand. This is good and bad. I mean, it's not really bad, but it's indifferent because I think you're always going to have enough command squads, command stands in your army to reach everybody with your feel no pain bubble. But I think maybe for things that are going to be sitting on objectives and guarding them, being able to give them an apothecary is a nice option. I'm also pretty indifferent about the new detachments. I think there's 1 or 2 standouts, but on the whole, I'm not sure how much use they're going to see from me or maybe in general. And I'll probably make a separate video talking about that. So overall, I think the Astartes list is probably the design team's best work. There are a few things that I'm not too happy with, but I think they've done a great job of adjusting what needs to be adjusted and making the list feel more diverse and giving your choices and your options more weight. And that was something that I think they succeeded at generally in the Solar Auxilia list, but I think the Astartes list has been done even more effectively. Again, like I mentioned with the Solar Auxilia, I think the iconic formations seem really great, very flavorful, very true to life, if I can say that about a fictitious world. And from what I've seen, all of the special rules tied to the iconic formations seem to be actually effective and interesting on the table. So I'm excited to see those in play and see how they perform. Overall, I think that the Liber Strategia has been an excellent addition to the Legions Imperialis line. They've made some great revisions to all of the armies, and these changes are really, I think, going to improve the game in a positive and measurable way by increasing the ability for players to make meaningful choices and for their units to perform better compared to some of the units that they might have lost out to before these changes were made. I'm also particularly excited about the iconic formations. I know I've talked about this a couple times already, but I think they are exciting and evocative, and they feel really true to life. And I am really hoping to see these perform well and for Games Workshop to continue publishing these in the future. I do think that the Liber Strategia has failed to address some deeper thematic issues with Legions Imperialis, particularly the fact that the Legion special rules have been more or less untouched in any meaningful sense, and that Knights and Titans still feel pretty anemic and flavorless. I mean, they've definitely improved with these changes, but to me, they don't have the punch and the color that a Knight and Titan really should bring to the table. They just feel like just something that they just feel like big vehicles, and I feel like there should be more to them than that. There's also still some issues with weapon balance, so particularly with the Collegia Titanica, right? There are some weapons which are still far and away better than others, as we saw in the Solar Auxilia list with the Lehman Russ and the Malcador variants. Although they've adjusted the points some, I don't think they've gone far enough to the point that you might actually start considering taking some of the more specialized variants. Nevertheless, with all that said, all those caveats out of the way, I think it's clear that the game designers are addressing real issues that have been encountered in the game, and they're attempting to make changes in order to fix those problems. And on the whole, I'd say that they've been very successful. I think that the addition of the Liber Strategia has improved Legions Imperialis, and I'm looking forward to, I'm still on vacation, I'm still in France, so I haven't really had a chance to try these changes for myself on the battlefield, but I'm looking forward to getting that chance when I get home and seeing how the game has adapted and adjusted based on the Liber Strategia. So as always, I'm excited and interested to talk with you about your thoughts on the Liber Strategia and these changes. If you've had a chance to play the game with these changes, make sure you leave a comment down below and let me know what your experience has been like. If you enjoyed the video, please like and subscribe. It really helps me and helps the channel. If you'd like to support us directly, we do have channel memberships available. If you'd like to get more involved with the channel and participate in some of the stuff that is coming up, our community show that we're going to start here this month, where we're going to show works in progress photos and battle plans, tactics, just general questions are all going to be contained in that. and maybe even live streams coming up in the next month or two. So I'm going to leave it there, guys. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll see you in the next one.